Hey guys, Dr. Sitzel here. So in this video we're going to cover labor markets, and we're going to answer several questions, starting with why do people doing the same job in different places get paid differently? How are wages determined? Why does education raise wages? And do unions help workers? So the first thing that we want to go over, because we're going to establish a market for labor, is the demand for labor. So firms hire workers when that worker increases revenue more than cost. So this is back to that idea in economics about trade-offs. So how much do workers increase revenue? Well, that's related to their marginal product of labor. So the change in output created for a firm by hiring another worker is sort of the traditional definition of marginal product of labor. In Cowan and Tabarrok, they also include the definition the increase in a firm's revenue created by hiring another worker. Of course, these are related since increasing output will increase revenue in the course of business. So we can think of a lot of things that also impact the cost of hiring a worker. The most obvious thing is pay, but there are other forms of compensation. We'll talk a bunch about that later in the video, but think about things like insurance. But there's also transaction costs. So you have to find workers, we might call that search, and there is training. So we end up having to prepare the workers. They don't come ready to do exactly the job that we want them to do, perhaps. So a worker is hired when their marginal product is higher than their wage. So that's roughly stating what we had before, revenue higher than cost. Another way to say that is when your marginal product is higher than your wage. So let's take a look at the marginal productivity of labor. We have a very classic graph here that I've done in the normal stylized fashion. There are other ways to do it. In fact, we might draw one of them here in a moment. But we're looking at the change in output, so the change in Q for every unit of labor that gets hired. So there are three phases to the marginal productivity of labor curve. Notice that I'm specifying labor. You can also have marginal productivity of capital. So first is what we call specialization, and during this phase, when you add more workers, their productivity rises. So what's happening here is if I have one worker and I add a second, they'll split the tasks between them. I like the example for, say, a restaurant. Suppose that you had a one-man show running a restaurant, something like McDonald's, right? And so you have several tasks, and maybe you need to cook the food, take the orders, deliver the food, and keep the place clean. Well, if I just have one worker, he or she has to do all of those. If I hire another worker, then they might split those tasks between them. One of them runs the register and takes the orders and cleans things, and the other cooks and delivers the food. So they would then get better at what it is that they're doing. So specialization is increasing returns to adding labor because you can focus. Of course, naturally, anyone in college believes in this because you have a degree plan. That degree that you're pursuing is a type of specialization. Right? So I'm teaching this class because I'm specialized in economics. If you're an accounting major or a finance major or management major, those would be your specialization. And in fact, when you get in the workplace, you'll find that even those are general compared to what you'll actually be doing. So if you're an accountant, perhaps you'll be doing tax returns, or perhaps you'll be helping businesses just keep track of their accounting needs. So there's lots of different ways that you will specialize, and you'll further specialize. Say you're a tax accountant, you may be a tax accountant for businesses, or you may be a tax accountant for individuals. However, at some point, this begins to fall off. The specialization is sort of, as we've discussed elsewhere in this class, in theory, there's sort of no limit to that, right? Think back to our elemental case for free trade. But there are other factors at play, and we call those diminishing returns. So if I have 4 workers now at my hypothetical McDonald's here, and one is cooking and one is cleaning and one is delivering food and one is taking sales, what's the value of adding a 5th worker? Well, it isn't nearly as high, or it in relation to the previous, it won't be nearly as high because you're going to have a lesser task in terms of increasing output that you're going to allocate to that fifth worker. And if I hire a sixth worker and seventh worker and so on, I'll have two people cooking now. But the jump from having one person to two would be very large. The jump from having 4 to 5 would be very small, because that fifth task is a second cook or a second person on the register. Very important and potentially worthwhile. Notice all these values are positive, but maybe not as, you'll see a decreasing return to them is the important lesson here. At some point, though, you can actually have the marginal product curve run negative. And what's happened here is you've added so many workers. Perhaps I have 12 workers now in the McDonald's, and so it's overcrowded. They're getting in each other's way, or maybe one of those workers, when I hired that 10th worker, now they don't really have anything to do, so they stand around and talk to their coworkers and distract them, right? So there are ways for this to end up negative. Okay, let's take another look at this. So basically I presented the productivity argument. Remember that we had marginal productivity of labor defined in the context of output and defined in revenue. These are the same thing, and I'm going to show you here. So this is an example from Cowan and Tabarrok. And here they're using janitors for like our hypothetical McDonald's, or perhaps this is an office, right? And so when you hire a janitor, what's the first thing you're going to hire them to do? Well, it's going to be to clean restrooms, and that might have very, very high marginal productivity, right? So the value that would bring to the firm might be $35. And then if you hire a second worker, you might assign them to empty the trash, because clean restrooms and empty trash bins, those are some of the most important things that can be done with janitorial services, right? And you can see that's very valuable, not quite as valuable as cleaning the restroom. But cleaning the restroom is so important that if we hire a third person, actually what we'd like them to do is allow the janitorial crew to clean bathrooms twice a day. That doesn't have as high value as the first time, but it's very valuable. We hire a fourth, they would mop. If we hire a fifth, they would get the outside trash and allow this person to handle the inside trash or something like that. Clean restrooms a third time a day. Now we want to clean the windows, so we can think about this would be relatively unimportant compared to having clean restrooms. Suppose your budget was really, really tight and you could only hire one janitor, then they would be cleaning restrooms way before they would be cleaning windows, okay? And then maybe finally the last thing here is if we could hire 8 of them, we would only get like $8 of value out of that, but they would take the gum off the underside of tables, okay? So notice several things here. One is that marginal productivity of labor declines, so as we add more workers, the return to the labor falls. This is a normal course of things, right? Because of this, as wage falls, task importance falls. So when we assign new people here, we end up wanting to assign them less and less important tasks, because when we are willing to pay the most and we're at the highest point, we're going to end up with wanting to focus on the most important tasks. All right, so what would this look like in practice? So basically what I've done here is I've graphed, so we could label this, right? So this is basically our price and our labor. Really, I should call this wage, because that's what we're going to call it the rest of the time. This is the wage. Okay, so if the wage is $35, that'll be the point on the demand curve, right? So this is our demand for labor. So here's a very important point, right? We're used to thinking about demand as being the consumer, and that is always true. But because of our natural way that we think about this, when we think about demand, we're thinking about non-businesses. But in this case, the business is demanding the labor, and the households are providing it. So when we draw a supply curve, we're drawing a supply curve of a household. So in a labor market, sort of the roles are reversed from the way that we usually think about them. So the demand for labor, if we're at 30, if the wage is $35, this firm will just want the one worker, right? If it's 30, they'll want 2, and we saw, we could just graph this whole chart, right? So there's 24, and so on, right? Excuse me, I guess that one's 24. So suppose for a moment that the market wage is $10. Well, what will happen? They have a point on their demand curve where they are willing to pay, where they're getting marginal productivity of $11 an hour for their janitorial services, which means the guy that is providing, I'm saying the individual here that's providing $35, it's not specific to that individual. Maybe it is, but it's really about the task importance, right? So when they hire the first person, they'd have been willing to pay them $35, but they can end up paying them $11, and because of that, they're going to hire 7 workers, and that's what we see here. So the market wage, right, we can think of that as being akin to the competition outcome, where we get a price from a market, and it's reflected into the firm graph, firm demand after all, right? So they'll hire 7 people at $10 an hour, and they'll happily get surplus from all 7 workers that they ended up hiring, and so on, right? Okay. So now that we've established the demand for labor, we want to work on the supply for labor. So supply for labor is fundamentally about a trade-off. And the trade-off is between your leisure, your free time, and the amount of consumption that you want to do. Okay, so this has a very interesting property, though, because what happens if we look at the individual compared to the market? Right, which I've already denoted here, but I wanted to make that very clear. The individual will increase the number of hours that they work as the wage increases up to 7, and so their supply curve looks like this, right? But once they're getting paid $7 an hour, what's going to happen? This is probably 40 hours a week, right? And so if you increase their wage 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, all the way up to 16, they don't actually add any more hours for you. This would be pretty normal, right? I'm showing up at work, I'm getting paid more, that's fine, right? And why do I increase my wage? This is a hypothetical curve, by the way. Everyone's curve would look different, and that's going to be an important point. But up to some point, right, you're not really adding hours to what you're working. You're just taking the benefit because you're increasing your consumption as your wage increases, and you're not trading off any leisure. So this is benefit. But why might someone increase $17, $18, $19, $20 an hour? Why might they suddenly increase the number of hours that they work? Well, now perhaps a big purchase in their consumption becomes accessible, right? So I was making $16 an hour, and I was just taking that money, I was saving it, I was eating out more or something, and all of a sudden, if you raise my wage up to $17, $18, $19, $20 an hour, now perhaps I'm looking at buying a new car, and so I'll work more hours, right? So think about what's happening, at the revenue here, right? Because if you're making 7 and you're working 40, that's this, area is your wage. If you're making 16, this area is your wage, right? Like, it's more than doubled, obviously. But if you're making, let's try 18, now this is your revenue. So hopefully that's kind of revenue, so your total pay, right? So we want to think about that as a reason that different things that we're purchasing or different behaviors that we're engaged in. If I'm making $16 an hour, I might work only 40 hours a week, and I might not buy a house. I'll just keep renting. But if you're going to pay me $20 an hour, then I might say, well, let me work more than 40. Let me work 50 hours a week, increase the amount that I'm working by 25%, and then live in a house instead of an apartment. But what happens as you actually increase the wage? This is what's called a backwards bending supply curve, right? So normally our supply curves are just, obviously look like this, right? And they're just very straight. And as we say, well, it's weird that this would actually decrease. Well, the answer is, if you're an individual who's making $28 an hour, right, you're better off working 40 than if you're making 20 and working 50, perhaps, right? I didn't do the math on that, but just hypothetically, let's think through that. And you might then be able to go back, right? Because you don't want to work, you want consumption, I think there is intrinsic value to work, but let's set that aside for the moment. You're probably intrinsic value working at 40, although some people probably take intrinsic value from working 50 hours and then telling everyone how hard it is that they work, right? So as the pay goes up, right, your consumption also goes up, and so you can make the trade-off back from consumption towards leisure. So people who make money up to a certain point, right, they might just increase the number of hours that they're willing to work, and then when they reach a certain level, like that's a comfortable level of hours for them to work, and they increase their consumption just by having their wage go up, and then perhaps there are certain things for them to purchase or change their lifestyle if their wages go up, but that needs to happen in conjunction with an increase in hours. But after some point, here it's $20 an hour, you can actually increase or keep your consumption stable and decrease the number of hours and trade back off towards leisure and consumption. So our concern would be, well, does this make a supply curve for the market look like this wonky supply curve that we have for the individual? The answer is no, because individual supply curves have different shapes, right? So we might have an individual whose supply curve comes straight up to 16 and then just jumps up and then curves back way higher, right? And there's any number of reasons for this. But in general, when you increase the wage in a market, you will get more hours. So what will happen for the individual when I go from 17 to 16 dollars an hour? Well, this individual might not provide any more hours, but we might induce another person into the market. We might have somebody whose supply curve, looks like that, and they just increase well beyond the number of hours they were providing, right? It could, of course, be higher. They produce fewer hours. This would mean they're leisurely valuable, or their alternative non-working time is very important to them, right? And we will generally think that the supply curve for hours, for labor, will generally just rise in step with wages, because there are many people making decisions that look like this, and their curves all look different. But in general, people's curves go this way. At some point they bend back, but that will be a very, very high point in the market, even if it's not a particularly high part of the curve for an individual. Okay, now that we have supply and demand of labor, we can do a very straightforward thing. This looks like every curve that you've seen, every market graph that you've seen before. Supply curve going up, demand curve going down, right? So notice, right, we had that stair step thing before, but as we have different firms in a market, they will all end up with, that'll sort of smooth out their curve, right? Because you're averaging the curves together, so that stair-step effect for all the different firms will cause this situation where we also have a smooth demand curve. Of course, that's much easier to see than a backward bending supply curve. What happens then? Well, in this situation, we end up with an equilibrium number of hours and an equilibrium wage. Okay, very straightforward, all things that we're comfortable with to this point in the class. What I want to turn to now is different issues that are happening in the labor market, and really a very important question, which is, why do people doing the same job in different places get paid differently? Of course, fundamentally, it will come down to marginal product of labor. So working for a more productive firm raises your marginal productivity of labor. It's an important lesson and an unintuitive lesson. Let's take an example firm, right? So suppose that you have a situation where we're in an office, it's got huge capital investment, it's got very highly productive workers, it's got a big brand, and the product value is off the charts. What's the value of the janitorial services in that building? Pretty high. What happens if we're in an office environment with low capital investment, the co-worker's productivity is very low, the brand is not very important, and the product value just overall isn't very high? The importance of the work, the marginal productivity of the janitors in that setting will not be very high. So these things will impact the marginal productivity of labor. So why do people in different places get paid differently? Because their marginal productivity is different. Doing the same job in a large city, this is why wages for the same task in a rural area versus a big city are very different, because the work that's happening in say the downtown Manhattan, right, is very important work, and so the janitors in that setting, you're going to have to hire a lot of them, and their wages and their pay will be quite a bit different than if we're hiring somebody in a rural city. So the takeaway here is that laborers get the benefit of productivity in other sectors. It's very important to grasp this idea that the labor and the wage that they're getting paid, remember we've said this before, right? We've just proven the labor theory of value, right? It's about the marginal productivity of that labor. And what this means is working the same job in a very productive sector is a different thing than working the same job in a very unproductive sector. Okay, so let's take a look at what this might look like in practice. Okay, so let's say we have the supply curve for the USA and the demand curve for the USA, right? Those will be the labor market trade-offs are very high, right? And this is because the alternative uses of your time in terms of leisure for an individual, for a household in the United States is very high. The leisure that we have is important to us. But the demand is also high, and this is because the marginal productivity of a particular job in the United States is very high, and so they're willing to pay a lot for it. Okay, let's take a look at a quintessential example of like India, right? So in India, you're going to have relatively, right, so the supply curve is much to the right, so more workers, and a trade-off more towards consumption because of what margin they are on in terms of their consumption and leisure, and relatively low marginal productivity because the firms in the United States are the most productive in the world and the firms in India are not as productive. What's the outcome? Well, the outcome is that the wage happening in the United States is very high. The hours that are being used there are very low. The wage in the United States in India is very low, and the hours are very high. Of course, you would immediately recognize that this is exactly the scenario that we observe in reality. So, demand is based on the marginal productivity of labor. That is much higher in the United States than it is in India. And this has more or less nothing to do with the labor stock that is in those places. It does have some. But the marginal productivity is also dependent on the productivity of the sectors. As I've argued elsewhere in this class, this is one of the reasons that economic growth is very, very important, because a rising tide raises all ships, as it were, in terms of your productivity. The fact that I am an economics professor in the United States and not in India means I get paid a lot more, because in the context of the United States economy, it is much more valuable to be an economist than it is elsewhere in the world, and that has as much to do with the productivity of Walmart and Amazon and Google and whatever large firms that you're thinking of here, and not just large firms, all firms, right? As it does anywhere else, right? So the success and productivity of Starbucks affects me, and my success also affects Starbucks, so there's an interrelated nature, because our marginal productivity also reflects the productivity of other sectors. Okay? The supply curve represents the leisure consumption trade-off, just as before. In the United States, we have very high trade-off between the leisure and consumption, right? And we have to have high wages in order to induce us to give more hours. And in India, as you might imagine, that would be lower. Okay, let's turn our attention to why wages differ at the individual level. And the answer is essentially human capital. We've met the idea of capital elsewhere in this class. When we introduced capital before, the idea is the tools used to make something. So if you take a finance class, they'll say, well, your capital is your investment money. In economics, we mean something else. We mean capital are the things used to produce other things. Human capital naturally is the features of an individual that are used to produce other things. Cowan and Tabarrok call them the tools of the mind. These include education, skill, experience. We could actually list many other things, right? Intuition might go on here, for example, and lots of other ways. But I think those three categories sort of catch the broad case of it, right? So these are produced by investment, which you know because you're in a college course, right? And they also create an enormous wage premium. The return to college education is not just very large. So by that I mean having a high school degree compared to having a college education is something, last I remember, something like 70% increase in your lifetime earnings, right? So you almost double what you're earning. But not only is it increasing, it's actually rising over time. So by the time you're sending your children to college, it'll probably will be 100% increase. And remember, that's because of the marginal productivity of labor and the value of a college education. Okay, let me put a small asterisk in here. There is an important case being made by an economist named Bryan Caplan in his book called The Case Against Education. It's a phenomenal read. If you're interested in these things, I highly recommend it. But what he says is education is also engaged in what's called signaling. So yes, you're learning some things, you are investing, you are increasing your education skill and maybe even experience in a certain way, but you're also telling businesses what type of individual you are. You're telling them something about your intelligence, your conscientiousness, and your competence, right? So you're navigating the educational system, you're enrolling in classes, you're getting green lighted, you're adhering to deadlines that your professors give you, and you're signaling your intelligence about and your work ethic, all these many things here. So that doesn't make college education any less important, but it's not pure investment, it is also signaling. Now, the question is, Caplan is certainly right. The question is what percentage, and Kaplan's book essentially argues it's a high percentage of signaling and a low percentage of investment. Perhaps a more romantic view of this would be a high proportion of investment and a little bit of signaling, and that signaling is very valuable. Okay, so tied to our idea of human capital is what we call compensating differentials. This is the difference in wages that offset differences in working conditions. So wage is not the only monetary compensation. Here I've produced a short list. You can probably think of other things, and maybe you can email me your list of things and then I'll add to the list the next time that I teach the class. The first and most obvious one is safety, right? So if I'm working a very, very dangerous job, right? We all love shows like Ice Road Trucker and Deep Sea Fishing, right? And the individuals that are fishing for crabs, for example, that's a very dangerous job, and you're going to have to pay individuals more because that consumption leisure trade-off is compounded by the safety involved. If you work a very safe white-collar office job, then you're not getting a premium for the danger of the job. There are sort of lots of examples of this, but we can think of many, many dangerous jobs, and of course those naturally pay higher. Another idea is security. So a job that you could be fired at any moment, you're going to have to pay people more to take because they're trying to make their way through life. If you have a situation where your job is very secure, you have a contract. Of course, the best example of this is the tenure system for college professors, right? So you don't have to pay college professors as much because you might potentially be promising them a job with very few conditions down the road. Your coworker is an important factor in monetary compensation. Of course, in other classes, your professors might call this business culture or environment, right? But I worked a construction job when I was between my freshman and sophomore year, so maybe around the time that you are now in your career arc of college. And I worked with very many individuals that were not very pleasant to be around, right? They made very crude jokes, and they just generally were not thoughtful or pleasant people. Now I work in a university, and my coworkers are very bright, and they also care about economics, and so, we go get coffee and talk about complex things like compensating differentials. You don't have to pay me as much in the second environment as you do in the first. Another is enjoyment. Some jobs are very pleasant. Some jobs really are not very pleasant. You're not going to have to pay people as much, perhaps, to work at a fair and paint children's faces. That's kind of an enjoyment. That's kind of a job you would enjoy. You might have to pay people quite a lot to get them to scrub toilets. Schedule and flexibility really matters. So if you're in a job where you're on a rigid 9 to 5, or maybe you're working long hours, that's different than if you can get off at 3 to go pick your kids up from school. An important factor is also satisfaction. So if you're in a job that you feel like this could be done by a robot, I'm not making a meaningful difference in the world, I'm going and I'm doing this unimportant task, as opposed to something where you're feeling like this job really satisfies my need to feel like a productive individual, you would have to be paid less to do that job. And in fact, we see lots of examples of that, of people working for very low wages when they're doing things that are sort of non-profit jobs that benefit many people. Upside is a big one. So by this, what I mean is you can pay people very relatively low wages if there's a chance for them to work their way up the corporate ladder and get into a job that is very, very highly paid, very prestigious, something like that. I didn't add prestige on here, so maybe that's one I'll add next time I teach. But this is an important example when you take a labor economics class, is talking about why do CEOs get paid so much. And I think this is a huge part of the answer, because if I have a bunch of junior executives and then the senior executive job is really good, extraordinary pay, right? Paid like an athlete, flying a corporate jet around, being the head of a powerful company, that's what everyone wants, then I can pay my junior executives less because they will be working in part for a chance at that job. So people actually really like what we might call lotteries or tournaments, right? So instead of just, pay me what you can pay me, I dream about making it big. This is why young children love to think about making it to professional sports leagues, right? This is why you or I think about, working our way up a corporate ladder and being the president or CEO of somewhere, right? So you can pay people a lot less on the way there if there's potential prize ahead of them. Of course, this doesn't have to happen at only the executive level. That could just be pay your managers really well, and that motivates even your midline managers, and that motivates your frontline managers, something like that. Of course, the least interesting one, but one that definitely needs to be said, are other types of benefits. Examples of this would be insurance, vacation time, lots of examples there. A work phone or a work car, lots of things that can be added there that are compensating differentials. So imagine you had a very safe, very secure job with great coworkers that you loved. The schedule was super flexible. Your satisfaction was through the roof. It's a ton of upside, and you had great benefits. Well, you don't have to pay somebody very much to do that job because it comes with it checks all the boxes, as it were. Now imagine a very dangerous job that you could be fired at any moment. Your coworkers suck. You hate the job. The schedule is as rigid as can be. You work many long hours. It seems like you're doing something that doesn't matter at all, and there's no potential upside, and the benefits are crap. You're going to have to pay a lot in cash, as it were, to get that. Okay? So the takeaway here is that similar jobs have to have similar compensation packages, right? So if two individuals are doing very similar tasks, but the wages aren't the same, you have to ask a question, why is this? Well, there's actually an important example here, actually also from Tyler Cowen, not in his textbook, but from his blog, marginalrevolution.com, which I highly recommend. You'll get a lot of good economics news and thought in a very counterintuitive way to approach the world. So it's very much worth the read. But he says, when you see a job that seemingly has low pay, does that mean the individuals in that job are paid too little? Well, if a lot of people want the job, then obviously not. So we can say a good example of this is like teachers, right? So we say teachers get paid too little, and that might be true because there isn't really a well-functioning market there because public schools are run by local governments, and a lot of the funding comes from federal government. So we'd see a very different situation where wages would rise a lot in a private setting. But lots of people want to be teachers. Why? It's a very safe job. Your job security is pretty good. Your coworkers are probably decent. A lot of people enjoy working with kids. The schedule isn't terrible. Probably, if you really value your summers, it's probably really good. Job satisfaction very high. I don't know that the upside is very high, and hopefully the benefits are solid. So there's just a lot of compensating differentials. The wage would then predictably be quite a bit lower. And none of us question why, power line repairman is a well-paid job. It's very, very dangerous. There's probably not especially good security there. Perhaps, I don't know anything about the coworkers in that setting, but perhaps they're not very good. Perhaps it's not a job that one would enjoy. It's kind of industrial, kind of commercial. Maybe the schedule's really bad. They're going to have to call you out on nights and weekends, and you were really hoping to watch the ball game Saturday, and now you're having to go out and repair something on an emergency. Perhaps you don't feel like that's a very important job. Your satisfaction is low. There's no upside in it. Of course, those individuals have to be paid highly. Okay, so what does this look like in our classic framework here? Remember, we said supply and demand is the workhorse model in economics. Suppose that we have a job, and here's our demand for that job. And we have a situation where we have a low risk seeking and a high risk seeking version of the supply, right? So we have two sets of individuals or households that are potentially supplying these jobs, right? In this situation, you're going to end up with two very different outcomes, right? So I'm just saying this job is not very risky, this job is very risky, and suppose the demand curve for them were the same, right? Well, you're going to get lower wage, more hours worked in the low risk job, and a higher wage, whatever that looks like, right? So we could even label that compensation, and fewer hours worked in that situation. But high risk in this case, I should be careful. This is genuinely a wage, not compensation. So the high risk situation is one of the compensating factors. That's what I mean by that. So if you're making the leisure consumption trade-off, if there's a lot of physical risk involved, you're going to have to be paid more, and you're going to want to do less of it. I think these are very straightforward ideas. So higher wage, lower hours worked, that's fundamentally because it takes a higher wage to make us make the same kind of trade-off if one of our compensating differentials is working against us then. Okay, so what we can do with compensating differentials is think about the effect that is happening sort of economy-wide or even worldwide, right? One of the things that we observe is that money buys safety. Money buys many things, right? So I'm not saying money exclusively buys safety. Money buys many things, but we typically are good at thinking about the other things. If you get a raise and now you're going to make more money, you think about types of things that you would get: house, car, electronics, vacation time, not just vacation time, but travel, right? You buy some plane tickets and go see the world, right? But it also buys safety. And this is important, right? Because that is also a thing that we care about. And people who are lower on the wage or compensation scale, they're willing to do jobs that are riskier. This is why U.S. jobs are safer, because economic growth has led to increased wealth, which reduces your willingness to accept risk, right? As wealth rises, willingness to accept risk falls. This leads to a couple of things, right? One is increased job safety or higher pay for risky jobs. So again, I've said this several times, I'll keep saying it, economic growth is important for ethical reasons as well. Job safety is one of those things. Okay, last thing that we want to touch on in this lecture is the effect of unions. So unions do an important thing, right? It's a collusion, honestly, where they restrict the amount that they are going to supply. What does this cause? Well, for a given demand curve, without a union, there will be more hours worked. With a union, there will be fewer, and that will lead to an increase in wages. So does this help the individuals who are in the union? Well, it does raise their wage, so that's a good thing. The problem is it lowers your hours, but it also might lower the jobs or the number of workers that are involved in an industry. So it's really a trade-off. One of those things that happens here is if you can get into a union and if you can get a job, then it's raising your wages. It might cut your hours, but it's raising your wages. And it's a classic trade-off situation. So there probably are winners and losers manufactured by unions because some of those people aren't getting jobs or they're not able to make it into the union. Those people are being harmed at the benefit of those who get the hours because they have higher wages.